Tonight we explore the harsh, the unpredictable, and the inglorious reality of combat. Set aside the clashing blades and the masterful tactics of commanders. Beyond the flags of mighty forces lies a far more silent and far more fatal leader. Placed into one of those military encampments, your most dangerous foe wouldn't wield a sword. It would be lurking in the very fabric of your clothing. So, before you settle in, take a second to give the video a thumbs up and hit subscribe, but only if you truly appreciate what I create here. And share in the comments where you're watching from and what time zone you're in. It's always interesting to discover who's watching from across the globe. Now, turn down the lights and let's begin tonight's story together. The year is 1489. In the sun-baked plains of Andalusia, a city of pale walls and intricate architecture holds its ground. This is Granada, the final treasure of the emirate, the closing breath of almost 8 centuries of Islamic presence in Iberia. Beyond its fortifications, a different kind of settlement has emerged from the earth, a settlement of fabric and iron, of devotion and aspiration. This is the vast Christian encampment of Queen Isabella IV of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon. For a decade, their reconquest has been a slow, relentless triumph, a holy campaign to unite Spain beneath a single faith. Now only Granada stands. The siege is an enormous operation, a logistical marvel of its era. Countless thousands of fighters, hired soldiers from throughout Europe, warriors, builders, and support personnel are assembled. It is the biggest, most organized, most advanced force the continent has witnessed in generations. They possess everything: artillery to pound the fortifications, a structured chain of command, and the unwavering determination of their Catholic rulers. They assume they have prepared for every challenge, every opponent. But another force is assembling within their own numbers, a quiet, uncommitted, and deeply patient force. It does not bear spears or firearms. It does not advance under any standard. Its fighters are infinitely microscopic, and its battlefield is the human frame. As the siege extends through the scorching summer and into the wet cold of winter, the circumstances in the vast encampment begin to deteriorate. It's a settlement without sewage systems, a metropolis of men existing in tight quarters. They use the same bedding. They crowd together for heat. They rarely clean their thick woolen garments. And in the creases of those garments, in the layers of their uniforms, the human body louse, Pediculus humanus, discovers its haven. The louse is an uncomplicated organism. It requires little warmth, a consistent source of human blood, and a spot to deposit its eggs. The Spanish encampment is an ideal sprawling habitat for it. And within the digestive system of the louse, an even simpler life form, a bacterium named Rickettsia prowazekii, lingers. It is a hitchhiker, an obligate intracellular parasite. It cannot survive independently. It requires a host inside a host. When the louse feeds on a human for nourishment, it eliminates waste. And in that microscopic particle of louse excrement, the Rickettsia bacteria swarm. The puncture itches. The fighter mindlessly scratches. And with that simple automatic gesture, he transfers the excrement into the small puncture. The invader has entered. Initially, no one pays attention. A handful of fighters felt sick. A headache, a shiver, the kind of thing one anticipates when resting on frozen earth. But then the temperature arrived. A sudden, savage climbing temperature that left men trembling violently one instant and scorching the next. A stupor would appear, a crippling exhaustion. And then the marker. Around the 5th day, a skin eruption would appear across the torso and stomach, extending to the extremities. Small reddish marks that deepen to a dark, threatening purple. The Spanish fighters, observing this spotted skin eruption on the flesh of their companions, assigned it a title. They named it El Tabardillo, the little cloak for how it appeared to cover the body. But this was no garment of warmth. It was a burial cloth. The men became confused, their thoughts lost in a haze of temperature. Their complexions became dark and puffy. Some acquired a dry, persistent cough. Others a gangrene that blackened their digits and fingertips. The vast modern force of Ferdinand and Isabella began to crumble from inside. The encampment doctors were powerless. They attempted bloodletting, purging, and prayers. Nothing succeeded. The sickness did not differentiate between nobleman and common soldier, between the devout and the wicked. It travelled through the shelters with an invisible democratic brutality. Men who were vigorous at sunrise were deceased by sunset. The gravediggers could not maintain pace. The magnitude of the dying was apocalyptic. Ferdinand and Isabella had lost approximately 3,000 fighters to fighting over the entire previous year of the Granada conflict. In just the final few months of 1489, this new pestilence, this tabardillo, eliminated over 17,000. 17,000 men, an entire force erased not by Moorish blades or artillery, but by an affliction that flourished in their own squalor. The siege wavered on the edge of failure. Spirit vanished. The encampment, once a representation of Christian strength, became a massive infirmary and morgue. It was a frightening instruction, a first harsh demonstration of a new truth in combat. A force was a concentrated mobile community, an ideal breeding ground for outbreak sickness. You could construct the most powerful defenses, create the keenest weapons, and hold the most stubborn conviction. But your entire venture could be destroyed by an insect too tiny to observe and an illness no one comprehended. The Spanish eventually endured. The siege maintained, and in 1492 Granada surrendered. But the triumph was shadowed by the recollection of the quiet epidemic. El Tabardillo, what would later be recognized across Europe as Typhus, had made its official entrance on the platform of history. It had displayed its strength, its inclination for fighters, and its deep disregard to planning. It was a quiet warning written in the Spanish soil of the destruction it would cause on the magnificent ambitions of monarchs and emperors for centuries ahead. But the sickness was not simply a warrior's ally. While forces provided a travelling temporary settlement for the louse, it discovered more lasting stationary residences in the misery of Europe's growing towns. The circumstances of the military encampment, excessive crowding, inadequate nutrition, and absence of cleanliness were reflected and in many respects perfected in another kind of establishment, the prison. To grasp the horror of what came to be named jail fever, you must first eliminate your contemporary understanding of a jail. A 16th century English prison was not a location of government-funded recovery. It was a hole, a dark, damp, and hopeless business operation. A prisoner was not a charge of the government. He was a source of revenue for the keeper. In locations like the infamous Blockade prison in Oxford or the Fleet in London, inmates were crammed into filthy, poorly ventilated cells, sometimes dozens to a space intended for a handful. They rested on decaying straw that was seldom, if at all, replaced. This straw was a haven for lice, rodents, and fleas. There was no hygiene. Human waste accumulated in corners or was tossed into a central courtyard. Water was frequently contaminated, and most critically, survival relied on wealth. Prisoners were required to purchase everything: their meals, their water, their bedding, even the benefit of having their chains loosened. Those with affluent families might exist in relative ease, but the overwhelming majority, the debtors, the vagrants, the minor criminals, possessed nothing. They gradually starved, their bodies deteriorating, their immune systems failing. They were a captive, ideal population for the louse and its concealed cargo. Jail fever was a persistent, simmering threat in these locations, an anticipated part of the squalid existence. It was a sickness of the abandoned, targeting those who had already been rejected by society. But occasionally, the sickness would alert the world outside the barriers of a prison were penetrable. It would extend and affect the very individuals who delivered the king's justice. These incidents were named the Black Assizes. They were regular court sessions conducted in county towns where judges from the high courts in London would journey to oversee the accumulation of criminal proceedings. The most notorious of these happened in Oxford in the summer of 1577. The location was the court at Oxford Castle. The atmosphere in the courtroom on July 4th was by all descriptions heavy and disgusting. It was a warm day. The space was filled with judges, jurors, lawyers, witnesses, and observers, all compressed together in their thick woolen robes and doublets. Then the prisoners were escorted up from the dungeons beneath. One man specifically, Roland Jenks, a bold, foul-mouthed bookseller accused of sedition, was brought to confront the court. As he and the other prisoners stood in the dock, witnesses afterward remembered a nauseating, pestilent odour that radiated from them. The stench of unwashed frames, of illness, and of the dungeon itself. The court authorities, men of influence and status, wrinkled their noses. They held perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces, but it was already finished. The lice, or the particles of their dried excrement, had become airborne. They had journeyed from the rags of the prisoners to the velvet robes of the judiciary. The trial finished. Jenks was condemned to have his ears severed. The judges and jurors departed, satisfied with their duty, but the genuine sentence of the day had not yet been delivered. Within days, individuals who had been in that courtroom began to become sick. The first to perish was Sir Robert Bell, the Lord Chief Baron of the Exchequer, one of the most influential judges in England. Then Sir Robert Doyley, the High Sheriff of Oxfordshire. Then 2 knights, the Clerk of Assize and most of the jurors from the Grand Jury. The illness extended from the castle into the town of Oxford. It eliminated doctors who cared for the ill, priests who administered the last rites, and family members who nursed their loved ones. Over the following month, more than 300 individuals in Oxford perished. The university closed down. The town was seized by fear. What was so shocking about the Black Assizes of Oxford was not the sickness itself. Typhus was familiar enough. It was the sheer brutal reversal of the social hierarchy. This was a sickness of the poor, the filthy, the imprisoned. It was meant to remain in its place down in the shadows. But in that stifling courtroom, it had jumped across the divide of class and authority. It had climbed out of the dungeon and onto the judge's platform. It proved that the powerful could not simply disregard the circumstances of the powerless without repercussion. The suffering they contained behind stone barriers had a method of seeping out. The Black Assizes of 1577 and others like it in Cambridge and Exeter served as a chilling warning. Jail fever was not just an affliction. It was a form of judgment delivered indiscriminately upon the guilty and the innocent, the prisoner and the jailer, the condemned and the judge alike. It was the vengeance of the dispossessed, enacted by an agent that recognized no law but its own biology. The very circumstances of the prison, the excessive crowding, the malnutrition, the filth, and the hopelessness were about to be expanded to a continental scale. The jail was about to become a realm, and the prisoners an entire community. The platform for this disaster was the center of Europe, the collection of fragmented states, principalities, and bishoprics known as the Holy Roman Empire. The year was 1618, and what started as a local religious argument in Bohemia, the famous defenestration of Prague, would spiral outwards into the most devastating conflict Europe had yet witnessed, the 30 Years' War. It was not one conflict, but a sequence of interconnected wars, a whirlwind of changing allegiances, religious passion, and raw political greed that would continue for 3 hellish decades, and marching through it all, feeding it, directing it, and often concluding it was Typhus. The forces of the 30 Years' War were unlike anything that had existed before. They were massive multinational mercenary armies, the force of the Catholic League under Count Tilly, the imperial armies of the brilliant and ruthless Albrecht von Wallenstein, the disciplined Protestant legions of the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus. These were not just fighting armies. They were vast, crawling settlements on the move, with tens of thousands of fighters, accompanied by an even larger number of camp followers, wives, children, merchants, blacksmiths, cooks, and prostitutes. They were entire communities in motion, and their logistics were harsh and straightforward. A force marched on its stomach, and there were no organized supply chains as we would understand them. These forces lived off the territory. They were a swarm of locusts, devouring everything in their route. This created the ideal storm for Typhus to become not just an outbreak, but an apocalypse. The pattern was relentless and foreseeable. A force, say, Wallenstein's numbering 20,000 fighters and another 100,000 followers, would advance into a region of Germany. They would capture all the provisions, all the grain, all the livestock. The local community would be abandoned to starve. The fighters crammed into seized barns or temporary encampments lived in filth. Lice were omnipresent, a persistent, irritating feature of existence, referred to dismissively as German comrades. Soon typhus, often named camp fever or Hungarian fever, would erupt. It would sweep through the formations, eliminating thousands of fighters. But it did not halt there. The fighters foraging for provisions or abandoning would transmit the lice and the sickness to the already starving and weakened peasant settlements. The force, having devoured everything and now afflicted with sickness, would be compelled to advance, seeking fresh territory to consume. But they left a ghost region behind them, a territory of abandoned farms, where the few survivors were too feeble to plant or gather, and the force carried the seeds of the epidemic with them, prepared to plant it in the next unfortunate province on their line of advance. The sickness was a more decisive leader than any commander. It controlled the pace of the conflict. Campaigns were frequently stopped not by winter or strategic loss, but because the force had simply ceased to operate, its formation so reduced by typhus, dysentery, and plague that it could no longer battle. Historians have frequently concentrated on the major battles, the White Mountain, Lutzen, Nördlingen. But the reality is that for every fighter eliminated by a sword or a musket ball, at least 3 and perhaps as many as 10 were eliminated by sickness. Typhus was the quiet victorious commander in 100 campaigns. Consider the epic confrontation of 1632. Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, the Protestant champion, had swept through Germany. He confronted Wallenstein, the enigmatic and brilliant imperial leader, near the city of Nuremberg. It was the greatest standoff of the conflict. Wallenstein constructed a massive fortified encampment, challenging the Swedes to assault. Gustavus Adolphus built his own equally vast encampment and settled in for a siege. The two largest forces of the conflict, nearly 200,000 individuals in total, including camp followers, sat facing each other for weeks under the scorching summer heat. A major decisive engagement seemed imminent, but the engagement never occurred. Instead, the genuine conflict was fought in the latrine pits and the crowded shelters. With so many individuals compressed together, hygiene collapsed. The water supply became polluted, food became scarce, and typhus, along with its grim relative dysentery, began its labor. The encampments became giant death chambers. In the Swedish encampment, fighters perished at a rate of hundreds per day. The situation was just as terrible on Wallenstein's side. The proud, disciplined forces rotted from the inside out. After 2 months, both commanders were compelled to admit loss, not to each other, but to the pestilence. They withdrew their positions and marched their skeletal forces away, having lost tens of thousands of men without engaging a single major battle. The fields around Nuremberg were left choked with the shallow graves of fighters who had perished, not for God or for glory, but from a fever transmitted by a louse. This pattern repeated itself across the German territories for 3 decades. Cities were besieged, and even if they held out against the cannons, their crowded communities would be devastated by typhus. Magdeburg, before its infamous sack in 1631, was devastated by the sickness. It was everywhere, a persistent, terrifying background sound to the conflict. It destroyed the distinction between combatant and civilian. A peasant hiding in the woods from marauding fighters was as likely to perish from typhus brought by a refugee as the fighter was to perish in his own filthy encampment. The magnitude of the demographic collapse is difficult to grasp. The Holy Roman Empire was not a unified nation, so records are incomplete. But modern calculations suggest that its community fell from around 20 million to perhaps as low as 12 million. Some regions were hit even harder. Württemberg lost 3/4 of its inhabitants. Pomerania perhaps 2/3. Entire settlements vanished from the map. Their inhabitants deceased or fled, their fields returning to forest. While conflict, famine, and the bubonic plague all contributed their part, typhus was the vast, relentless engine of this devastation. It was the ideal war epidemic. It thrived on the movement of forces, it exploited the malnutrition of civilians, and it flourished in the very breakdown of social structure that the conflict itself had caused. When the exhausted diplomats finally assembled in Westphalia in 1648 to hammer out a peace, they were negotiating over a corpse of a continent. The old structure had been destroyed and millions were deceased. The grand religious and political causes that had initiated the conflict seemed like a bitter mockery in the face of such utter devastation. The genuine victor of the 30 Years' War was not the Habsburgs or the Bourbons, not Catholicism or Protestantism. The victor was an ancient 6-legged insect and the bacteria it transported in its gut. Typhus had demonstrated that it could do more than disrupt a siege. It could hollow out an entire civilization, leaving behind a silence that would require a century to fill. The year is 1812, and Europe is holding its breath. A force is assembling, a power the likes of which the world has never truly witnessed. It's not merely a force, it is a torrent of humanity, a river of steel and ambition, and its title is La Grande Armée. Napoleon Bonaparte, master of the continent, has assembled more than 500,000 men. Some sources claim 600,000. The figure is so vast it becomes an abstraction. They are drawn from 20 nations, a mosaic of conquered and allied peoples, all advancing under the French eagle. There are Frenchmen and Poles, Italians and Bavarians, Prussians and Austrians, all bound for the vast, unknowable plains of Russia. Napoleon's strategy is, as always, a masterpiece of logistics on paper. He has calculated the tons of flour, the barrels of wine, the bushels of oats, the precise number of horseshoes and cannonballs required to subdue the Tsar. He is prepared for every contingency of combat, every feint and parry of his human opponents. But his meticulous ledgers, his maps crisscrossed with confident lines of advance, have overlooked the smallest fighter in the formations. A force travels on its stomach, the old saying goes, but it also travels in its clothes and in the seams of the heavy wool coats, in the folds of the linen shirts of this vast multitude. A passenger has arrived for the journey, uninvited, unaccounted for. The body louse, Pediculus humanus corporis, is a creature of opportunity. It thrives not in filth precisely, but in congregation. It requires warmth, and it requires the close, constant proximity of its hosts. The Grande Armée is the most ideal incubator it could have ever imagined. As the vast human river flows eastward across Europe in the spring and early summer, the circumstances begin to ripen. The men are crammed into barns and billets at night, sometimes dozens to a space, resting shoulder to shoulder for warmth. Marches are long and dusty. Uniforms are worn for weeks on end, saturated with sweat and dirt. The simple act of washing oneself or one's clothes becomes a forgotten luxury, and so the louse begins its own quiet, methodical campaign. It travels from man to man, from regiment to regiment, a quiet contagion passed in the night. It is a minor nuisance at first, an itch, a common fighter's complaint lost in the noise of 100,000 other discomforts. But this particular louse carries a hitchhiker of its own. Deep within its gut resides the bacterium Rickettsia prowazekii, and when the louse bites, it defecates. The man, irritated by the bite, scratches. With a simple, thoughtless motion of his own fingernail, he rubs the louse's infected feces into the tiny wound. The invasion begins. The force crosses the Niemen River into Russia in late June. The heat is oppressive. The roads dissolve into dust. Dysentery, the bloody flux, is already stalking the columns, a grim consequence of fouled water supplies. But then a new illness appears, a different kind of fever. It begins with a headache, a deep splitting pain behind the eyes, then chills that rack the body, followed by a soaring temperature. A rash appears around the 5th day, a strange mottled bloom of dark red spots across the chest and abdomen. The men call it many things: camp fever, jail fever, ship fever. Its formal name is typhus. The fighters, strong veterans who have faced Austrian cannons and Prussian cavalry, become weak, delirious, their minds lost in a fog of fever. They stumble out of the marching column and collapse by the side of the road, left for the rear guard to collect. But the rear guard is already overwhelmed. The medical corps, for all of Napoleon's planning, is completely unprepared for a biological crisis on this scale. They have wagons for the wounded, but a wounded man is a finite problem. A sick man is a vector. Every man who falls ill is a living factory producing more lice, which will seek out new warm bodies as their host begins to cool with death. The sickness spreads geometrically. By the time the force reaches Smolensk in August, it has already been bled white, not by Russian bayonets, but by microbes. Tens of thousands of men have simply vanished from the rolls, deceased or deserted, too sick to continue. The fighting when it happens is brutal, but the battles account for only a fraction of the losses. For every fighter killed by a musket ball, several more are being silently executed by an insect. Napoleon, obsessed with the decisive engagement that will bring the Tsar to the negotiating table, pushes onward. He is a gambler, doubling down on a losing hand. He sees his force shrinking, but he believes victory in Moscow will solve everything. The Battle of Borodino in September is a horrific grinding slaughter, the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. The French win a tactical victory, but it is a Pyrrhic one. The road to Moscow is open. Yet the force that advances into the ancient capital is a ghost of the army that crossed the Niemen. It is a hollowed-out shell ravaged by a month-long typhus outbreak. And Moscow, when they arrive, is empty. And then it burns. The retreat begins in mid-October, and this is when the true catastrophe unfolds. Now the three great forces of dissolution work in concert: starvation, the freezing cold of the Russian winter, and typhus. The cold is a catalyst. The men huddle closer together for warmth, sharing blankets, sharing coats taken from the deceased, sharing lice. They're too weak from hunger to maintain any semblance of hygiene. Their immunity is shattered. Typhus, which had been smouldering in the formations, now erupts into a full-blown firestorm. The sickness itself is made worse by the cold. The Rickettsia bacterium constricts the small blood vessels. In the freezing temperatures, this leads to catastrophic frostbite, to gangrene. Men's fingers and toes, noses and ears turn black and die. The retreat is not a march. It is a death procession. It is a long, stumbling column of spectral figures shrouded in rags shuffling through the snow. The living are barely distinguishable from the deceased. And all along the route from Moscow back to the Berezina River and beyond, they leave a trail not just of discarded equipment and frozen corpses, but of infected lice. The little vector, having finished with one host, will cling to a cast-off bit of cloth, waiting in the cold for the next warm body to pass by. When the Russians pursue, when peasants return to their settlements, they too will pick up the deadly inheritance left behind in the snow. Of the more than 500,000 men who advanced into Russia with such confidence, fewer than 50,000 would stumble back across the Niemen River in December, and even they were not safe. They were walking skeletons, and many were incubators. As they were funneled into makeshift hospitals in cities like Vilnius and Königsberg, they brought the epidemic with them. The outbreak they carried sparked new epidemics that would sweep across Poland and Germany in 1813, eliminating hundreds of thousands more, fighters and civilians alike. Napoleon had faced down the combined forces of Europe and won. He had redrawn the map of a continent, but he was defeated by an organism he could not see and a vector he did not consider. His grand force was not annihilated by General Winter alone. It was destroyed by a far more patient, a far more efficient commander, General Laus. The grandest military endeavor of the 19th century was undone by the biology of a tiny insect. A lesson written in the lives of 500,000 men. A lesson that history, in its own slow, methodical way, would have to learn again and again. The louse, of course, does not care for uniforms. It is an equal opportunity parasite. Its primary concern is a warm body and a steady supply of blood. Whether that body belongs to a fighter in Napoleon's Imperial Guard or a tenant farmer in County Cork, a generation after the snowy plains of Russia became a graveyard, the louse would find its next great theatre of operations not amidst the clash of forces, but in the profound and terrible silence of a starving nation. In the mid-1840s, Ireland was a country balanced on a knife's edge. Much of its rural community, millions of individuals, subsisted almost entirely on a single crop, the potato. It was a nutritional marvel capable of feeding a family on just a tiny patch of land. But this dependence was a terrible vulnerability. In 1845, a strange blight appeared. A fungus-like organism called Phytophthora infestans drifted in on the wind. The leaves of the potato plants withered and turned black, and the tubers in the ground rotted into a foul-smelling, inedible slime. The harvest failed. The next year it failed again, more completely, and the year after that. A great hunger and Gortamor descended upon the land. Starvation is a slow, quiet process. It strips away fat, then muscle. It dulls the mind, and crucially, it dismantles the body's defenses. A starving community is a community with its immune system switched off. And as hunger drove individuals from their small holdings, the ancient partner of famine appeared. They called it famine fever. It was typhus. The mechanism was brutally simple, a chain reaction of social collapse. With their food source gone, families were evicted from their cottages for failing to pay rent. They took to the roads carrying what little they possessed, searching for work, for food, for charity. Society itself began to break down. The customary rituals of washing, of cleanliness, of community, all fell away in the face of overwhelming desperation. Individuals huddled together for warmth along the roadsides, in ditches, in makeshift shelters. They wore the same clothes, the same rags for months, and in these circumstances, the lice flourished as never before. The famine did not create the lice, but it created the ideal circumstances for their propagation. The British government's response was tragically inadequate, rooted in a philosophy that discouraged direct aid. Instead of food, they offered the workhouse. These were grim, prison-like establishments where the destitute could receive shelter and meagre rations in exchange for hard labor. To get relief, a family had to surrender its land if they had any left and enter the workhouse gates where they would be separated. Men in one wing, women in another, children in a third. The workhouses were designed to be unpleasant, to deter all but the truly desperate, and the desperate came in droves. They were already weak, already starving, and many were already carrying lice. The workhouses became the epicenters of the outbreak. Hundreds of individuals were crammed into spaces designed for far fewer, resting on straw pallets, their bodies pressed close together. Typhus swept through these buildings like fire through dry grass. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and illness. The low, constant murmur was of feverish, delirious souls. Doctors and staff who tried to help often succumbed themselves. The workhouse intended as a house of refuge became a house of death. The fever did not stay within the workhouse barriers. It travelled with every person who moved across the landscape. It was in the crowded soup kitchens, in the relief depots, in the port cities where desperate crowds gathered, hoping for passage to a new world. And it was here on the docks of Dublin, Cork and Liverpool that typhus boarded the ships. These vessels, often poorly provisioned and dangerously overcrowded, would become known as coffin ships. For a small fee, a family could buy passage to North America. They were crammed into the dark, airless holds, spaces sometimes no taller than 5 feet, with no sanitation and little food or water. The journey could take weeks, even months. It was a floating version of the workhouse, an ideal storm for sickness. A single person carrying lice could infect an entire hold. In the darkness below deck, with the ship pitching on the Atlantic waves, typhus ran rampant. Individuals grew sick and perished in their bunks, sometimes lying beside the living for days before their bodies could be committed to the sea. The voyage was a gamble with death, a desperate flight from a land of starvation into the arms of a floating epidemic. One of the most tragic destinations was Grosse-Île, a quarantine station in the St. Lawrence River, downstream from Quebec City. This was the first stop for ships arriving in Canada. In the summer of 1847, an avalanche of coffin ships descended on the island. They were filled with the deceased and the dying. The small medical station was utterly overwhelmed. At its peak, dozens of ships were anchored in a line miles long, waiting to be cleared. Their yellow quarantine flags a signal of the pestilence within. Priests and doctors who rowed out to the ships described scenes from a nightmare. Holds filled with hundreds of individuals, many too weak to move, lying in their own filth, ravaged by typhus and dysentery. On Grosse-Île itself, canvas tents and makeshift wooden sheds were erected to house the thousands of sick Irish immigrants. It was not enough. More than 5,000 individuals perished and were buried there in mass graves. The island became a monument to the suffering of the famine and to the devastating power of famine fever. Back in Ireland, the blight eventually receded, but the country was forever changed. At least 1 million individuals had perished, and 1 million more had emigrated. A significant portion of those deaths were not from starvation itself, but from the sicknesses that followed in its wake, with typhus as the chief executioner. It was a demographic catastrophe driven by a fungus on a potato, but its lethal power was amplified 1,000-fold by the louse, an insect that turned a crisis of hunger into a pandemic of fever. Just a few years later, as Ireland was still reeling, two of the great powers who had presided over the famine, Britain and France, would find themselves sending their own forces into another charnel house of sickness. This time the theatre was the Black Sea, the conflict, the Crimean War. It was in many ways a curiously modern conflict. It was a conflict of telegraphs, of steamships, of rifled muskets. It was covered by the first war correspondents sending dispatches back to London in near real time. It felt new, industrial, efficient, and yet the primary agent of death would be the same ancient foe that had plagued forces since the dawn of time. The conflict, which began in 1853, pitted Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire against Imperial Russia. The logistics of supplying a large force so far from home proved to be a nightmare for the British command, an organisation mired in aristocratic incompetence and bureaucratic inertia. While the battles of Alma, Balaclava, and Inkerman were savage, the real enemy was once again the one you could not see. The winter of 1854 was brutal. The British fighters were stuck in trenches before the besieged city of Sevastopol. They were ill-equipped, lacking proper winter clothing, decent food, and even fuel to cook it. They huddled in their thin tents and muddy dugouts, wearing the same lice-infested uniforms for months on end. Scurvy, dysentery, and cholera began to tear through the formations. The sick and wounded were transported by ship across the Black Sea to the sprawling barrack hospital at Scutari on the Asian side of the Bosphorus opposite Constantinople. And it was here that the full horror of the force's medical failure was revealed. Scutari was not a hospital. It was an antechamber to the grave. It was a vast, filthy barracks built over a leaking sewer. Wounded men were laid on straw pallets on the floor, so close together you could barely walk between them. They were still in the uniforms they had been wounded in, caked with mud and blood. There were few blankets, fewer bandages, and almost no medical supplies. Rats scurried through the wards, and the atmosphere was a putrid miasma of infection and decay. And in this ideal environment, typhus, the classic camp fever, took hold. Into this hell came a figure who would become a legend, Florence Nightingale. She arrived in November 1854 with a small contingent of volunteer nurses, a formidable, determined woman armed with statistics, a belief in sanitation, and an unshakable will to fight the bureaucracy. Nightingale was not a microbe hunter. The germ theory of sickness was still years from being accepted. She, like most of her contemporaries, believed in miasma, the idea that sickness was caused by foul air, by effluvia rising from filth and decay. She didn't know about Rickettsia prowazekii, and she likely gave little specific thought to the lice crawling on her patients. But her mistaken theory led her to the right actions. She waged conflict on the filth. She had the sewers flushed. She had the walls whitewashed. She got her nurses to scrub the floors, to wash the patients' linens, to provide them with clean clothes and decent food. She fought the military procurement officers for every bedpan, every bar of soap, every clean bandage. Her famous lamp, as she made her nightly rounds, was a symbol of compassion. But her true weapon was the scrubbing brush. By fighting the filth, she was indirectly fighting the louse. By providing clean bedding and clothes, she was interrupting its life cycle. By improving ventilation and reducing overcrowding, she was making it harder for the vector to spread. But it was an uphill struggle against an entrenched enemy. Typhus continued to claim victims, not just among the common fighters, but among the doctors and nurses trying to save them. The sickness worked its way through the wards with a quiet, methodical persistence. A fighter might survive a grievous wound from a cannonball only to succumb to a fever that began with a simple insect bite. The irony was profound. Here was a modern force with advanced weaponry and global reach, being decimated by the same circumstances that destroyed medieval forces. The statistics were appalling. In the first winter of the conflict, for every one British fighter killed in action, at least 4 perished of sickness. At Scutari, the death rate at one point reached a staggering 42%. It was a national scandal, a humiliation brought to light by newspaper reports and Nightingale's own damning letters. Nightingale's work and the public outcry it generated eventually forced massive reforms. A sanitary commission arrived from London and implemented sweeping changes dramatically improving drainage and water supplies. The death rates began to fall, but the lesson had been learned at a terrible cost. The Crimean War became a critical turning point, not because of its geopolitical outcome, which was ambiguous, but because it exposed the catastrophic consequences of neglecting the health and sanitation of a force. It demonstrated that victory did not just depend on strategy and firepower, but on conquering the invisible forces of microbes. Florence Nightingale returned to Britain a national hero, the founder of modern nursing. Her legacy was in professionalizing care, in using data to advocate for reform, in establishing the non-negotiable link between sanitation and health. She had battled an unseen enemy in the dark wards of Scutari. She may not have known its precise title or its exact method of transmission, but she knew its habitat. She knew it thrived in darkness, in squalor and in neglect. And by letting in the light, the fresh air and the simple power of cleanliness, she had shown the way forward. The louse, however, was not defeated. It had merely retreated, waiting for the next great congregation of humanity, the next conflict, the next moment of societal breakdown, to begin its quiet, devastating work once more. The Great American Conflict of the 1860s is remembered in oil paintings and sepia photographs, solemn men with magnificent beards, battle flags held against a smoky sky, the high drama of Pickett's charge, or the grim resolve at Antietam. But the genuine story of that conflict, the one that claimed the most lives, was not written in heroic couplets. It was written in the mundane, crawling misery of the encampments. For every fighter who fell to a rifle ball or a cannon shot, 2 more were carried away by sickness. And in the vast, teeming settlements of canvas and mud that were the military encampments, a quiet, unacknowledged conflict was being waged against an enemy that wore no uniform and carried no flag. They called it camp fever, a vague and frightening diagnosis that covered a multitude of sins: typhoid, dysentery, and of course the quiet, persistent hum of typhus. In the Union forces, where supply chains, however strained, generally functioned, the circumstances were merely terrible. But in the forces of the Confederacy, they were a portrait of systematic decay. The Union blockade was a noose slowly tightening around the South's neck, cutting off not just weapons and ammunition, but the simple necessities of existence. Soap became a luxury. New uniforms were a distant memory. The proud Confederate fighter, celebrated in song and story, was often a man dressed in rags. His uniform, a patchwork of repaired tears and hopeful stitches. His wool coat, his only shield against the cold Virginia nights, became his greatest enemy. It was an ideal home, a veritable metropolis for the body louse. Imagine an encampment outside Richmond in the winter of 1863. Thousands of men are huddled together for warmth. The atmosphere is thick with the smoke of green wood fires, the smell of unwashed bodies, of illness and mud. The men call the lice greybacks, a term of weary familiarity. They are a constant torment, an inescapable fact of existence. Fighters would sit by the fire, shirts off in the freezing air, running a hot bayonet or a heated stone along the seams of their clothing, listening for the satisfying pop and crackle as the insects and their eggs were cooked. They called this skirmishing, but it was a struggle they could never truly win. The lice were simply too numerous, the circumstances too ideal for their propagation. And where the lice went, typhus followed. It began subtly, a headache, aching limbs. The men would dismiss it as exhaustion, the price of a long march. But then the temperature would rise, a relentless baking heat that left them delirious, their minds filled with phantoms of home or combat. A skin eruption would appear across their torsos, small red spots that were the outward marker of the microscopic conflict raging within their blood vessels. In the crowded, poorly ventilated Sibley tents and makeshift log huts, the sickness would leap from man to man, not through the air, but carried silently in the gut of a louse that crawled from a feverish fighter to a healthy one resting beside him. Entire regiments were effectively erased from the order of combat, not by a cavalry charge, but by a fever. A commander might have 10,000 men on his muster roll, but when the time came to advance, he would be lucky if half of them could stand. The hospitals, if you could call them that, were overflowing. They were often just converted barns or churches, with sick men lying shoulder to shoulder on filthy straw, their delirious cries mingling in a constant desperate chorus. The surgeons, overwhelmed and armed with little more than quinine and opium, could do little but offer comfort and sign death certificates. They didn't understand the mechanism of transmission. They blamed miasma, bad air, or poor moral character. They saw the lice, of course. They were everywhere. But they were seen as a symptom of filth, not its cause, a nuisance, not the assassin. The strategic implications were immense. The conflict became a contest of attrition, not just of men and material, but of immune systems. A campaign's success could hinge on which side had better access to clean water and fresh vegetables. The Confederacy's logistical collapse was its undoing. The lack of soap, the inability to replace worn-out infested uniforms, the meager rations that weakened the fighters' bodies. All of this created an ideal storm for outbreak sickness. Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was not just starved into submission at Appomattox, it was sickened into it. The graybacks in the seams of their tattered uniforms were as potent a weapon for the Union as any Gatling gun. The tiny arthropod, feasting in the dark, was the Confederacy's most successful blockade runner, operating deep inside its own lines, bleeding its forces dry, one fevered fighter at a time. The louse had proven itself a master of 19th century combat, and its greatest performance was yet to come. 50 years later, the world had changed. Humanity had entered a new century, one of marvelous, terrifying invention. The automobile, the airplane, the machine gun. Conflict was now an industrial process, a matter of timetables, chemical formulas, and calculated ballistics. When the great powers of Europe stumbled into conflict in the summer of 1914, they brought with them the full might of this new modernity. On the Western Front, the conflict quickly bogged down into a unique and static form of hell, a lunar landscape of trenches, barbed wire, and mud stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. Here, the primary killers were artillery shells and machine gun bullets. Sickness was a problem, of course. Trench foot, influenza, but sanitation, however grim, was organized. There were delousing stations, there were supply chains. The conflict was brutal, but it was for the most part contained within its narrow, bloody corridor. But to the east, it was a different conflict entirely. The Eastern Front was a place of vast distances and dizzying movement. Whole forces surged back and forth across Poland, Galicia, and Russia over hundreds of miles. Empires, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, the Russian, were beginning to creak and groan under the strain, their ancient structures fracturing. And into these fractures, the old epidemics began to seep. This was not a conflict of static trenches, but of chaotic advances and desperate retreats, of entire communities uprooted, becoming columns of refugees clogging the roads, mingling with the fighters, resting in crowded barns and railway stations. It was a conflict of collapsing infrastructure. And in this chaos, typhus, the camp fever of old, found a continent-sized playground. On the Eastern Front, the louse was not a quartermaster's problem. It was a strategic reality. It was promoted from a pest to a weapon of mass destruction, and its lethality would dwarf that of poison gas or aerial bombing. The figures are difficult to comprehend, numbing in their magnitude. In the years during and immediately following the conflict, it is calculated that typhus infected as many as 30 million individuals in Eastern Europe and Russia. It eliminated at a minimum 3 million souls, a quiet, unrecorded holocaust carried on the back of an insect. It travelled with the forces, thrived in the prisoner of war encampments, and feasted on the collapse of civilization, while the commanders in the West measured their victories in yards of mud. The genuine victor in the East was Rickettsia Prowazaki. Nowhere was its strength more brutally demonstrated than in the tiny kingdom of Serbia. In late 1914, the Serbian force, outnumbered and outgunned, had achieved a miracle. They had decisively thrown back a massive Austro-Hungarian invasion, humiliating the Habsburg Empire and inspiring the Allies. They were heroes, but their victory came at a terrible price. They had taken over 70,000 enemy prisoners who were crowded into makeshift encampments with non-existent sanitation, and among those prisoners, the typhus bacterium was waiting. The winter of 1914 to 1915 in Serbia was bitterly cold. The country was exhausted. Its medical services stretched to the breaking point. Many of its doctors had been eliminated or captured in the fighting, and then the epidemic began. It started in the prisoner encampments and radiated outward, carried by fighters returning home on leave, by refugees, by the simple, ceaseless movement of individuals. By February 1915, Serbia was in the grip of one of the most explosive outbreaks in human history. At its peak, 10,000 new cases were being reported every single day. The country's infrastructure simply dissolved. The railroads stopped running because the crews were too sick to work. The government could barely function. There were not enough doctors, not enough nurses, not enough hospital beds. There were not enough grave diggers. In a nation of just over 4 million individuals, it is calculated that more than 150,000 civilians perished of typhus in a matter of months. A quarter of the nation's doctors, over 120 of them, perished while trying to treat the sick. And the heroic force that had defeated the Austrians, had simply ceased to exist as a fighting power. It melted away. Fighters lay shivering with fever in their barracks. Entire divisions were declared unfit for fighting. By the spring of 1915, the Serbian military had been effectively annihilated, not by the enemy, who were cautiously watching from across the border, but by an organism 1,000 times smaller than a grain of sand. The Austrians could have walked into Belgrade unopposed. It was perhaps the most decisive victory ever achieved by a microbe in a modern conflict. Typhus had accomplished what the Habsburg forces could not. The magnitude of the disaster prompted a massive international response. Medical teams from Britain, France, America, and Russia rushed to Serbia. They brought with them supplies, expertise, and a new understanding of sanitation. They established quarantine centers. They built bathhouses and mobile delousing units using steam autoclaves to disinfect fighters' uniforms by the thousands. They organized the local community into sanitary squads. Slowly, painstakingly, by waging a total conflict on the body louse, they brought the outbreak under control. But the damage was complete. Serbia was saved, but its force was a shadow of its former self. When the Central Powers invaded again in the autumn of 1915, the Serbs could offer little resistance, beginning the epic, tragic retreat of their entire force and government through the frozen mountains of Albania. The louse had been their conqueror. It had proven in the most terrible way imaginable that in the modern age of industrial combat, the smallest things still mattered most. The fate of nations, the outcome of great conflicts, could still be decided in the seams of a dirty uniform. But even as millions were perishing in the grip of this invisible enemy, a quiet revolution was beginning. The story of humanity's relationship with typhus had for millennia been one of passive endurance. It was a storm to be weathered, a divine punishment to be accepted, a mysterious miasma to be fled. But in the early years of the 20th century, that story began to change. The age of superstition was giving way to the age of the microscope. And far from the snows of Russia and the mud of Serbia, in a sun-drenched laboratory on the coast of North Africa, one man was about to unmask the killer. He was about to give the faceless epidemic a title, a description, and an address. And in doing so, he would show the world not how to endure typhus, but how to defeat it. His title was Charles Nicolle, a French physician and bacteriologist, a student of the great Louis Pasteur. In 1902, he was appointed the director of the Pasteur Institute in Tunis, the capital of the French Protectorate of Tunisia. Tunis was a city of contrasts of ancient medinas and modern colonial boulevards, and like many cities of its time, it had a typhus problem. The sickness was endemic, simmering away in the poorer quarters, flaring up in periodic deadly outbreaks. Nicolle, a man of intense curiosity and meticulous observation, set himself the task of understanding this old enemy. He began not in the laboratory but in the hospital ward. He was a clinician first, a man who paid attention to the world around him, and he noticed something peculiar, something that everyone else had seen, but no one had truly registered. He saw that typhus was terrifyingly contagious out in the city. Families living in the same crowded space would fall ill one after another. But once a patient was brought into the clean, well-ordered confines of the French colonial hospital, the chain of transmission was mysteriously broken. The doctors and nurses tending to the patients, changing their sheets, taking their temperatures, they almost never got sick. The sickness so virulent on the outside seemed to stop dead at the hospital doors. This was a profound puzzle. If typhus was transmitted through the air like influenza, or through contaminated water like typhoid, it should have run rampant through the hospital. But it didn't. Nicole pondered this. What was the critical difference between the world outside the hospital and the world inside? What happened at the moment of admission that could possibly halt the epidemic in its tracks? He replayed the process in his mind. A new patient arrives. They are taken to an admissions area, and there, before they are allowed into the clean wards, they are stripped of their filthy, vermin-infested clothes. They are given a vigorous bath with soap and water, and then they are dressed in a clean hospital gown. The clothes, the bath. Could it be that simple? The thought must have struck him like a flash of lightning. The vector was not the patient's breath. It was not their touch. It was something they carried on them. Something that was removed at the hospital entrance. Something that lived in the folds and seams of their clothing. The body louse. It was a brilliant hypothesis, born not from a microscope, but from simple, careful observation of human procedure. But a hypothesis is not a proof. Nicole, the rigorous scientist, knew he had to demonstrate it beyond all doubt. He needed an animal model, a creature that could contract human typhus. He tried monkeys with some success, but his breakthrough came with the chimpanzee. He took blood from a human patient suffering from typhus and injected it into a healthy chimp. The chimp developed a fever. It became ill. It had typhus. This was the first crucial step. He could now reliably transmit the sickness in a controlled laboratory setting. Now for the second, more important step. He took another healthy chimpanzee and kept it in a separate cage. He then collected body lice, those ubiquitous greybacks, from the clothing of human typhus patients. He placed these lice on the healthy chimp. For days, nothing happened. The experiment seemed to be a failure. Nicole was perplexed. He re-evaluated his methods. Perhaps the lice themselves were not enough. He needed to be more precise. He restarted the experiment with a new, elegant design. First, he infected a chimpanzee with typhus via a blood injection. Once this chimp was clearly sick, he placed a new batch of laboratory-bred clean lice upon it, allowing them to feed on its infected blood. After a few days, he carefully collected these now engorged lice and transferred them to a third perfectly healthy chimpanzee. He waited, and then after an incubation period of about 12 days, the third chimp began to shiver. Its temperature spiked. It developed all the classic signs of typhus. He had accomplished it. The chain of evidence was complete, irrefutable. It was a masterpiece of scientific deduction. The sickness passed from a sick human to a louse, and the infected louse passed it to a healthy host. The body louse, Pediculus humanus, was the culprit. For thousands of years, it had been humanity's constant itchy companion, a symbol of poverty and filth. Now it was revealed to be a serial killer, the unwitting accomplice to a bacterium that had toppled empires and decided the fate of forces. Nicole published his findings in 1909. It was a quiet announcement, a paper in a scientific journal, but its implications were world-shaking. The discovery changed everything. It transformed the fight against typhus from a struggle against a mysterious invisible power into a targeted campaign against a known enemy. The enemy was no longer a vague miasma in the air. It was a visible insect that could be fought and eliminated. The focus shifted from quarantine and prayer to hygiene and insecticide. The delousing stations that would save countless lives in the First World War. The public health campaigns centered on bathing and clean clothing. The later development of powerful insecticides like DDT. All of this became possible because of Charles Nicole's simple, profound observation in a Tunis hospital. He had not discovered a cure for typhus that would come later with antibiotics. He had accomplished something far more fundamental. He had revealed its secret. In 1928, Charles Nicole was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his work. It was a fitting honor for a man whose quiet, methodical work had saved and would continue to save millions of lives. He had stared into the heart of an ancient epidemic, and using nothing more than his powers of observation and the rigorous logic of the scientific method, he had unmasked the assassin. The age of enduring typhus was finished. The age of outsmarting it had begun. Humanity now knew its enemy, and for the first time in history, it had a fighting chance. Charles Nicolle had thrown open the door, revealing the louse as the furtive messenger of death. But the message itself, the genuine killer, the microscopic agent that the louse ferried from one bloodstream to another, remained a ghost in the machine. A frantic, dangerous race was on to capture it, to give the enemy a title and a face. It was a hunt that would take place not on battlefields, but under the brass and steel barrels of microscopes, and it would demand its own kind of sacrifice. One of the first and most brilliant hunters was an American pathologist from Ohio named Howard Taylor Ricketts. He was a man obsessed with the unseen world, a quiet, methodical pursuer of tiny assassins. He had already made his reputation in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana, wading into the terrifying mystery of Rocky Mountain's spotted fever. There he had proven the sickness was carried by a tick, and in the tick's tissues he had glimpsed just barely some minute rod-shaped organism. He couldn't isolate it, couldn't make it grow in a petri dish, but he knew he was close. It was a new kind of life, something that behaved like a bacterium, but could only survive inside the cells of its host. In 1909, the same year Nicolle was publishing his findings in Paris, Ricketts turned his gaze south to another fever, one the locals in Mexico City called tabardillo. It was, he quickly confirmed, classic epidemic typhus. And so he began the terrible work. The work required a steady hand and a cold nerve. It meant handling the blood of dying patients. It meant raising colonies of body lice, keeping them warm and alive in small boxes strapped to the bodies of typhus sufferers, letting them feed on infected blood. Then he would transfer these now deadly lice to healthy monkeys to prove transmission. It was a meticulous, patient, and profoundly hazardous process. Day after day in his small laboratory, he would dissect the gorged insects under his lens, teasing apart their delicate gut linings. And there he saw it again, the same kind of impossibly small organism he had seen in the ticks of Montana. A tiny, elusive bacterium that refused to grow on its own. He proposed a theory. Typhus and Rocky Mountain spotted fever were caused by a new class of microbes, organisms that bridge the gap between bacteria and viruses. He was on the verge of one of the great breakthroughs in medical history. He documented everything, his notebooks filling with precise drawings and observations. He was close, so very close, but the microbe he was hunting was also hunting him. On April 23, 1910, Ricketts felt the first telltale headache, the initial shiver of chills. He knew immediately what it was. He documented his own decline with the same scientific detachment he had applied to his patients, taking his temperature, noting the onset of the rash, the growing delirium. A week later, Howard Taylor Ricketts was deceased, eliminated by the very organism he was about to unmask. He was 39 years old. The torch, however, had been lit. Across the Atlantic in Germany, other researchers picked up the trail. One was an Austrian zoologist named Stanislaus von Prowatzek. He too was a brilliant and fearless investigator of the microscopic world. He travelled to Serbia in 1913 to study a typhus outbreak and then to Constantinople. Like Ricketts, he worked directly with infected lice, dissecting their intestinal tracts, straining his eyes to see the phantom pathogen. He confirmed Ricketts's findings, seeing the same minute bacteria multiplying in the louse's gut. He was working alongside a Brazilian physician and pathologist, Henrique da Rocha Lima, at the Institute for Maritime and Tropical Diseases in Hamburg. When the Great War erupted in 1914, their research became a matter of extreme military urgency. The Eastern Front was already descending into a typhus nightmare, and the German authorities needed answers. Prowatzek and da Rocha Lima were sent to a prisoner of war encampment in Cottbus, a place teeming with Russian fighters, lice, and typhus. It was the ideal horrible laboratory. There, amidst the squalor and death, they continued the work. They injected blood from prisoners into guinea pigs. They dissected the lice that fed on them. The risks were immense. The atmosphere itself seemed thick with the sickness. And in February of 1915, Stanislaus von Prowatzek, like Ricketts before him, fell ill. He perished just days later. Da Rocha Lima, heartbroken but resolute, carried on alone. He knew he owed it to his fallen colleagues to finish the job. He had Prowatzek's notebooks, Ricketts's papers, and his own tireless observations. He finally managed to isolate the organism from the lice of the deceased Russian prisoners. He proved conclusively that this was the agent of typhus. In 1916, with the conflict still raging, he published his findings. He proposed a title for the killer, a title that would serve as a permanent solemn memorial. He called it Rickettsia Prowatzeki. The enemy at last had an identity forged in the selfless, fatal courage of the men who had perished to find it. The enemy now had a title, Rickettsia Prowatzeki, and its accomplice, The body louse was well known. The hunt for the microscopic assassin was finished. A new conflict was about to begin, a conflict of extermination. This would not be a conflict fought with medicines or vaccines, not at first. It would be a conflict of engineering, logistics, and chemistry, a conflict on the louse itself. The First World War became the first great laboratory for this new kind of hygienic combat. Forces that had for centuries been resigned to losing more men to typhus than to bullets now attempted to fight back on an industrial scale. The solution was brutal and straightforward: heat. Lice and their eggs, known as nits, could not survive high temperatures. So, entire systems were built to boil and bake the insects out of existence. The British and French developed mobile delousing stations, great rumbling steam-powered contraptions that could be moved by train or truck just behind the front lines. The process was a ritual of humiliation and relief for the fighters. They would be marched unit by unit into long wooden huts. They would strip naked, every man surrendering his filthy vermin-infested uniform, his greatcoat, his underwear. Their heads were often shaved, while they scrubbed themselves down with harsh soap and cold water. Their clothes were bundled and thrown into massive steam autoclaves or hot air sterilizers. For 30 minutes, the uniforms were baked at a temperature that would eliminate every louse, every nit. The men would then retrieve their stiff, hot, and blessedly clean clothes. For a few days, perhaps a week, they would be free from the maddening itch, from the constant crawling sensation that drove men to distraction in the trenches. This was a logistical challenge on an almost unimaginable scale. The German force, fighting a two-front conflict and terrified of typhus sweeping in from the east, became masters of the delousing train. These were entire railway convoys dedicated to hygiene. One car would be for undressing, another filled with showers, another for drying, and several more containing the huge ovens for the uniforms. An entire battalion could be processed in a matter of hours. Sanitary cordons were established, delousing all troops moving from the typhus-ridden Eastern Front to the west. It was a constant Sisyphean task. As soon as a unit was cleaned, it would advance back to the frontline dugouts, back to the shared blankets and infrequent bathing. And within weeks the lice would return. The pattern would begin again. It was a struggle of attrition, not against an opposing force, but against a tiny insect that bred faster than it could be eliminated. The technology was crude, but the principle was revolutionary. For the first time, military command was treating hygiene not as a matter of personal discipline, but as a strategic imperative, a form of biological defense. The louse was now an official enemy of the state, but steam and heat were cumbersome. They required massive equipment, fuel, and time. What science truly sought was a chemical weapon, a magic bullet that could be deployed easily, cheaply, and on a massive scale. For 2 decades, the search continued in laboratories across the world. And then in 1939, just as the world was preparing to descend into conflict once more, it was found. It was found by a Swiss chemist named Paul Hermann Müller, working for the J.R. Geigy Company. He was screening chemicals for their effectiveness as moth-proofing agents for wool. One compound he tested was a white crystalline powder, a chlorinated hydrocarbon called dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, DDT. Its insecticidal properties were astonishing. It was cheap to produce, it was incredibly stable, remaining potent for months after being applied to a surface. And most importantly, it was lethal to a whole range of insects, including the body louse, while appearing at the time to be almost completely harmless to humans. It was a miracle. When the Second World War broke out, the Allies immediately grasped the strategic potential of DDT. This was the weapon that could finally decisively win the ancient conflict against typhus. The United States military began producing it by the ton. Every American fighter was issued a small shaker can of white powder containing 10% DDT for dusting inside his own clothes. But the genuine test, the great proof of concept, would come in the winter of 1943, in the ruined, chaotic city of Naples. The Allies had just captured the city from the Germans. The retreating force had systematically destroyed the infrastructure. The sewers were blown up. The water mains were cut, garbage piled up in the streets. Tens of thousands of individuals were homeless, huddled together in caves and bomb shelters. It was the ideal breeding ground for typhus, and as the cold weather set in, the sickness exploded. By December, cases were appearing by the hundreds. The Allied command faced a catastrophic public health crisis that threatened their entire Italian campaign. A force cannot fight if it is being decimated by a Lice-Borne epidemic in its rear. This time, however, they had DDT. The Rockefeller Foundation, working with the US Army, launched an unprecedented public health offensive. They established mass delousing stations all across the city. They were not boiling clothes this time. They were deploying the silent chemical weapon. Long lines of men, women, and children snaked through the rubble-strewn streets. One by one, they would step up to a health worker armed with a hand pump or a motorized air compressor. A nozzle would be stuck down the collar of their shirt, and with a hiss of compressed air, a cloud of white DDT powder would be blown across their chest and back. The nozzle went up their sleeves, up their trouser legs. The powder was puffed into hats, under skirts, into the hair of children. It was impersonal, efficient, and stunningly effective. Within a few minutes, a person was rendered toxic to any louse for weeks. Over the course of January 1944, more than 1,300,000 Italians in Naples were dusted. The results were dramatic. The typhus outbreak, which had been climbing exponentially, peaked and then collapsed. By February, it was finished. It was the first time in history that a major urban typhus outbreak had been stopped in its tracks. To the world at the time, DDT was not a controversial environmental toxin. It was a silver bullet, a white powder of salvation. It was the symbol of modern science triumphing over an ancient scourge. A clean, quiet victory in a world consumed by loud, dirty combat. At the very same moment that Allied health officials were dusting the citizens of Naples with the life-saving powder of DDT, a different kind of conflict against typhus was being waged in the north of Europe. Here the sickness was not an enemy to be conquered, but a tool to be cultivated, a weapon to be aimed. In the ghettos and concentration camps of Nazi Germany, typhus was being deliberately systematically weaponized as an instrument of genocide. The connection was not accidental. It was ideological. Central to Nazi propaganda was the language of pest control. They spoke of racial purity and national hygiene. In their twisted worldview, the Jewish people were not just a rival culture or religion. They were a biological contaminant, an epidemic upon the Aryan body politic. And the symbol they used over and over in their posters and films was the louse. The Jew was the louse, the carrier of typhus, the parasite that must be exterminated for the health of the nation. This grotesque metaphor became state policy. They would make the metaphor real. The Warsaw Ghetto was the largest and most infamous laboratory for this policy. In 1940, the Germans sealed nearly 500,000 Jews into a tiny 3.4 square kilometre section of the city. It was an act of calculated slow-motion murder. The official rationale given to the outside world was quarantine, to protect the rest of the city from the sicknesses supposedly rampant among the Jews. It was a lie. The quarantine was designed not to contain a sickness but to create one. The circumstances were engineered with lethal precision. The population density was almost 9 times that of the rest of Warsaw. Food rations were set at starvation levels, sometimes as low as 180 calories a day, destroying the immune system. The Germans deliberately cut off coal supplies, leaving individuals to freeze in the brutal Polish winters. Sanitation was non-existent. Water was scarce, and into this perfectly prepared petri dish, typhus was introduced and allowed to flourish. The louse, which thrives in circumstances of cold, crowding, and filth, found a paradise. The sickness swept through the ghetto like a fire. At its peak, it was infecting 100,000 individuals at a time. Jewish doctors and nurses with almost no medicine or equipment fought with desperate heroism to save their people. They organized secret medical schools, ran clandestine public health seminars on hygiene, and tried to isolate the sick. They knew exactly what the Germans were doing. The historian of the Warsaw Ghetto, Emanuel Ringelblum, wrote in his secret diary about the typhus politics of the Germans, noting how they deliberately blocked any attempt to bring in soap or disinfectants. The typhus outbreak became the ideal pretext for the Nazis. They could let the sickness do their work for them, a form of passive extermination. And when the time came for the mass deportations to the death camps, they could claim they were simply resettling individuals from a sickness-ridden area. The typhus they had so carefully nurtured became their alibi for mass murder. From the ghettos, the system was perfected in the vast network of concentration and extermination camps. Places like Auschwitz, Birkenau, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen were designed to be typhus factories. The process of dehumanization that began at the camp gates was also a process of biological preparation. Prisoners' heads were shaved. They were stripped of their clothes and given thin striped uniforms, often crawling with the lice of former occupants. They were crammed by the hundreds into unheated wooden barracks, resting on bare tiered bunks where they could not avoid constant physical contact. The latrines were overflowing pits. There was no soap, no way to wash. Starvation was the official policy. It was a system that stripped away every defense, both human and immunological, and then introduced the louse. Typhus became one of the camp's most reliable killers, a silent partner to the gas chambers and the firing squads. It required no bullets, no expensive Zyklon B gas. It required only neglect. The guards and camp commandants lived in constant fear of the sickness they were fostering, enforcing strict delousing protocols for themselves while ensuring the prisoners remained infested. It was the ultimate expression of their ideology. The master race clean and protected, the subhumans left to rot and be consumed by the very vermin they were equated with. For countless thousands, the end came not in a gas chamber, but in a delirious, fevered state on a filthy bunk covered in the telltale rash of epidemic typhus. It was in one of these camps, Bergen-Belsen, in the final chaotic months of the conflict, that the sickness would claim two of its most famous victims. In the winter of 1945, as Allied forces were closing in, the camp was overwhelmed with prisoners evacuated from other sites. The infrastructure collapsed completely. Typhus raged unchecked. Sometime in February or March, just weeks before British troops would liberate the camp, a 15-year-old girl named Anne Frank, already weakened by malnutrition and despair, succumbed to the fever. Her sister Margot perished a few days before her. Their deaths were not an accident of conflict. They were the intended logical outcome of a system that had turned a microbe into a policy and a louse into a fighter in a conflict of annihilation. The winter of 1943 was a particularly cold one in Naples, and the city was a ruin. Not a poetic ruin, not the kind that artists would later come to sketch, but a raw, functional, and deeply miserable one. For months, it had been a key target for Allied bombers, its port and rail yards systematically pounded into a landscape of skeletal buildings and rubble-choked streets. Then, as the Germans retreated north in October, they finished the job. They were masters of systematic destruction. They dynamited the port facilities, sank ships to block the harbour, and most cruelly destroyed the city's aqueducts and sewage systems. They blew up the power stations and burned the food warehouses. They left behind a city of 1 million souls with no clean water, no electricity, no sanitation, and very little food. Just as the cold rains of autumn began to fall, the individuals of Naples, who had endured so much, now huddled together for warmth in the unheated shells of their homes, in basements, and in the vast ancient network of caves and tunnels that ran beneath the city. They were cold, they were hungry, and they were crowded, terribly, terribly crowded. And into this ideal man-made incubator, the louse arrived, or rather, it had always been there, waiting patiently in the seams of clothing. But now its moment had come. Typhus began to smoulder quietly in the squalor of the city's poorest quarters in late October. A fever here, a headache there. Amidst the chaos of a recently liberated, starving city, it went unnoticed. It was just another misery among 1,000 others. But by December, the smouldering embers had been fanned into a flame. The case numbers began to climb, not in a gentle curve, but in the terrifying exponential spike that signals a full-blown outbreak. The city's hospitals, already overwhelmed and under-equipped, began to fill with delirious patients, their bodies racked with fever, their skin blooming with the telltale petechial rash. For the Allied armies, this was more than a humanitarian crisis. It was a strategic nightmare. Naples was not just a conquered city. It was the essential logistical hub for the entire Allied campaign in Italy. Through its newly cleared port, every bullet, every can of fuel, every fighter destined for the front lines against the Germans dug in at the Gustav Line had to pass. General Mark Clark's Fifth Army was entirely dependent on this one fragile lifeline. An uncontrolled typhus outbreak threatened to sever it completely. The louse, that tiny apolitical arthropod, could achieve what the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht could not. It could halt the Allied advance. It didn't distinguish between a Neapolitan civilian and an American GI. A louse-infested blanket, a shared moment of shelter from the cold, that was all it took. The sickness could jump from the civilian community to the troops, gutting entire divisions from within, paralyzing the conflict effort. The struggle for Italy was now being fought on two fronts, one against the German fortifications to the north, and another far more insidious one against Ricchezza Prowazeki in the streets of Naples. Fortunately for the Allies, they'd come prepared. They had not forgotten the lessons of the First World War. Attached to the invading force was a small specialized group from the United States of America Typhus Commission, a body created specifically to prevent the sickness from derailing the conflict. They understood the stakes. They knew that traditional methods of quarantine and delousing, methods that involved boiling clothes and shaving heads, would be far too slow. They would never catch up to the outbreak's ferocious pace. You cannot boil the clothes of 1 million individuals in the middle of a conflict zone. You needed a new weapon, a miracle. And they had one. It was a fine white crystalline powder with a faintly sweet chemical smell. Its full title was dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane. To the world, it would become known simply as DDT. Developed in 1939 by the Swiss chemist Paul Hermann Müller, it was an insecticide of terrifying potency. It was a nerve agent for insects, and to the louse it was instant death. It was also persistent, clinging to cloth fibers for weeks, eliminating any new lice that might hatch or wander by. In the context of 1943, it was not an ecological menace. It was a silver bullet. The challenge was not in the chemistry, but in the logistics. How do you deliver this miracle powder to an entire desperate, disorganized, and conflict-traumatized community? The answer was a masterclass in military efficiency applied to public health. The Allied military government, under the direction of Brigadier General Fred L. Soper of the Rockefeller Foundation, essentially declared conflict on the louse. They repurposed their immense logistical might, turning from the movement of tanks and ammunition to the systematic dusting of human beings. They established delousing stations all across the city. They took over cinemas, public squares, hospital lobbies, and even the large, airy caves where thousands of individuals were sheltering. The process was brutally, beautifully efficient. Long lines of men, women, and children would form. At the front of the line, a health worker, often an Allied fighter, would stand with a specially designed powder duster, a hand pump device with a long nozzle. With a few swift, practiced motions, the nozzle would be inserted up sleeves, down collars, and under waistbands. A few puffs of the pump sent a cloud of fine DDT powder billowing through the person's clothing, right down to their skin. It was impersonal, it was fast, and it was incredibly effective. Throughout the freezing month of January 1944, this process was repeated relentlessly across Naples. The magnitude of the operation was breathtaking. On some days, more than 50,000 individuals were dusted. Announcements were made over loudspeakers mounted on trucks that roamed the city, urging citizens to report to the nearest station. The program targeted everyone: hospital patients and staff, police officers, refugees, prisoners, and the entire community of neighborhoods where cases were highest. By the end of the month, over 1.3 million individuals had been treated. The military also set up a cordon sanitaire around the city, dusting every fighter and civilian moving in or out of Naples, ensuring the outbreak remained contained. It was the largest and most successful public health intervention of its kind in history. The results were immediate and dramatic. The epidemiological charts, which had shown a terrifyingly steep climb in cases through December and early January, suddenly plateaued. Then just as quickly the curve plunged downwards. The pattern of transmission had been broken. The adult lice were deceased, and the residual DDT on clothing eliminated the newly hatched nymphs before they could mature and spread the rickettsia. By February, new cases had dwindled to a trickle. By March, the Great Naples outbreak of 1943 was finished. The Allied conflict machine could continue to roll north. A force of public health officials and ordinary fighters, armed with nothing more than hand pumps and a white powder, had faced down one of history's greatest killers, and for the first time ever had stopped a major typhus outbreak in its tracks. It was a stunning victory, a moment of profound if fleeting optimism. It seemed that humanity, armed with the tools of modern science, had finally definitively conquered the louse. The victory in Naples was so absolute, so medically elegant, that it felt like a closing chapter. The subsequent years only seemed to confirm this. As the Second World War drew to a close, humanity found itself in possession of a powerful new arsenal against its ancient microbial enemies. Typhus, the shadow that had stalked every force in every refugee column for centuries, suddenly seemed beatable, a relic of a darker age. This newfound confidence rested on a tripod of progress. The first leg was, of course, the insecticides. DDT, the hero of Naples, went global. The World Health Organization, in its optimistic youth, launched massive campaigns to eradicate insect-borne sicknesses. Teams of health workers fanned out across the globe, spraying DDT inside homes to eliminate malaria-carrying mosquitoes and dusting communities to eliminate typhus-carrying lice. For a time, it felt like a chemical utopia, a world where pests could simply be erased. The second leg of the tripod was the dawn of the antibiotic age. The same conflict that had perfected DDT had also pushed the mass production of penicillin. Soon after, new drugs like tetracycline and doxycycline were discovered, and they were miraculously effective against rickettsial sicknesses. For the first time in history, typhus was not just preventable, it was curable. A sickness that had once carried a mortality rate of up to 60% was reduced to a treatable week-long fever. The terror was gone. A doctor could now write a prescription and send a patient home, confident of their recovery. The agonizing, delirium-filled deathbeds that had filled the hospitals of Dublin, the trenches of the Eastern Front, and the tenements of Naples were becoming a memory. And the third leg, perhaps the most important and most subtle, was the quiet, unglamorous but relentless march of improved hygiene. As nations rebuilt after the conflict, living standards in many parts of the world began to rise. Indoor plumbing became commonplace. Hot water was no longer a luxury. Washing machines proliferated. Individuals owned more than one set of clothes. They bathed regularly, and in doing so, they systematically dismantled the ecological niche of pediculus humanus. The body louse thrives in circumstances of infrequent washing and crowded living. It needs unlaundered clothes to lay its eggs, and it needs close human contact to spread. Modern post-war existence in the developed world was quite simply a hostile environment for it. Without its vector, the typhus pathogen, Rickettsia prowazekii, had nowhere to go, and so typhus faded. In the public imagination of the West, it became a forgotten epidemic. It was a historical curiosity, a subject for books and documentaries, something that happened to Napoleon's Grande Armée or to prisoners in concentration camps. It was a sickness of filth, of conflict, of a past that felt reassuringly distant. Individuals worried about heart disease, cancer, and later AIDS. No one worried about typhus. The public health infrastructure built to combat it was slowly, quietly repurposed or dismantled. The expertise, the institutional memory of how to fight a Lice-Borne outbreak began to atrophy. Humanity, it seemed, had won, but the sickness never truly vanished. It simply retreated, receding from the brightly lit, sanitized world of post-war prosperity into the shadows, into the pockets of human misery that persisted. It became and remains an indicator species for societal breakdown. Like a persistent, opportunistic scavenger, it waits for the structures of civilization, clean water, sanitation, housing, public order to crumble, and when they do, it returns. In the mid-1990s, the tiny Central African nation of Burundi was torn apart by civil conflict and genocide. Hundreds of thousands of individuals were displaced, forced into vast, sprawling refugee encampments. These encampments were a grim echo of the past, overcrowded, unsanitary, and filled with traumatized individuals who had fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And there, in the misery of the encampments, typhus re-emerged with a vengeance. Tens of thousands of cases were reported. Doctors Without Borders and other aid agencies scrambled to respond, setting up emergency delousing stations, distributing soap and rushing in supplies of doxycycline. The scenes were eerily familiar to anyone who had studied the photographs from Naples 50 years earlier. The long lines, the tired faces, the quiet desperation. History was not repeating itself on a grand continental scale. But in these concentrated pockets of despair, the ancient dance between louse, microbe, and human continued unabated. It surfaced in other dark corners too, in the overcrowded, underfunded prisons of Eastern Europe and Africa, among homeless communities in cold-weather cities, where individuals huddle together for warmth in shelters or on the streets, sharing blankets and clothes. Anywhere the delicate veil of modern hygiene is torn, the louse can find a home and the microbe is patient. It can lie dormant for decades within a human host who survived an earlier infection only to reactivate later in existence, causing a milder form of the sickness known as Brill-Zinsser disease. An elderly person suffering a relapse can then become a new reservoir capable of infecting lice that feed on them, and starting the pattern of epidemic typhus all over again. Should the circumstances be right, the pathogen has a long memory, and the weapons that had seemed so miraculous in the 1940s began to show their age. The louse, with the simple, relentless power of evolution, began to develop resistance to DDT and other insecticides. The silver bullet was no longer so reliable. Simultaneously, the overuse of antibiotics globally raised the terrifying spectre of drug-resistant bacteria. While drug-resistant typhus is not yet a major clinical problem, the possibility hangs in the air, a reminder that our chemical shields are not invulnerable. The The forgotten epidemic had not been vanquished. It had merely been relegated. It had become a persistent low-level threat, a sickness of the poor, the displaced, and the forgotten. A stark reminder that the conflict against it is never truly finished, and that our victory is only as secure as the sanitation systems, the housing, and the social stability we build around ourselves. From the quiet persistence of the pathogen in the world's forgotten corners, our story takes one final darker turn. It shifts from the sickness as an opportunist that exploits chaos to the chilling possibility of its use to deliberately create it. In the modern era, the spectre of typhus re-emerges not as an epidemic of forces, but as a potential weapon in the arsenal of bioterrorism. The focus moves from the crowded refugee encampment to the microbiology lab, from the public health official to the state security analyst. And when you look at Rickettsia prowazeki through this cold strategic lens, you begin to understand its appeal to those who would seek to cause mass disruption. Agencies like the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention classify potential bioterror agents into categories. Category A includes the worst of the worst pathogens like anthrax and smallpox, which pose the highest risk to national security. Typhus sits in Category B along with agents like ricin toxin and cholera. These are considered the second highest priority. They are moderately easy to disseminate, result in moderate morbidity and low mortality. But, and this is the key, they require a specific enhancement of public health and diagnostic capacity. In other words, they are agents of chaos. They are designed to sow fear and overwhelm systems. And by these criteria, typhus is a remarkably efficient candidate. Consider its characteristics from a terrorist's point of view. First, it has a significant mortality rate. Untreated, epidemic typhus can eliminate anywhere from 10 to 60% of its victims. This lethality alone makes it a serious threat, capable of causing widespread panic. Second, it is highly incapacitating. Even those who survive endure a week or two of profound illness, high fever, debilitating muscle pain, neurological symptoms, and utter exhaustion. An outbreak would not just eliminate individuals, it would cripple a city's workforce, filling hospital beds and pulling emergency responders out of commission. The goal of a bioterror attack is often not just a body count, but societal paralysis. Typhus excels at this. Then there is the issue of dissemination. The pathogen is not as hardy as anthrax spores, but it could be grown in a laboratory and aerosolized, dispersed as a fine mist over a populated area to be inhaled by its victims. This would bypass the louse entirely, leading to direct infection of the lungs and a potentially even more severe form of the sickness. Alternatively, and perhaps more insidiously, a terrorist group could cultivate a large community of infected body lice and release them in a vulnerable location, a crowded subway system, a sports stadium, or a homeless shelter. The attack would be silent and invisible. The vectors would simply crawl away, find new hosts, and begin the chain of transmission. This stealth is one of its most terrifying attributes as a weapon. The incubation period for typhus is 1 to 2 weeks. For 7 to 14 days after an attack, nothing would happen. Then individuals would begin to fall ill, but their initial symptoms, fever, chills, severe headache, are maddeningly non-specific. They mimic influenza or a dozen other common illnesses. Doctors would be confused. Only when the characteristic rash appeared 5 or 6 days into the illness would the genuine nature of the outbreak become clear. By then, the sickness would have a 2-week head start. Panic would set in, and the healthcare system would be completely overwhelmed, struggling to diagnose, isolate, and treat a flood of critically ill patients. This idea of using sickness as a weapon is sadly not a modern invention. The history of biological combat is as old as combat itself. Ancient forces understood the value of poisoning enemy wells with animal carcasses. In the 14th century, the attacking Mongols at the siege of Kaffa in Crimea used catapults to hurl the bodies of their own plagued deceased fighters over the city barriers, an act that some historians believe helped introduce the Black Death to Europe. The principle has always been the same, to turn an enemy's own biology against them. In the 20th century, this primitive practice was refined into a chilling science. The most infamous example is Unit 731 of the Imperial Japanese Army operating in Manchuria during the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II. Under the command of General Shiro Ishii, this unit conducted horrific experiments on human prisoners, deliberately infecting them with a ghastly catalogue of pathogens to study their effects and develop them into weapons. They worked extensively with plague, cholera, anthrax, and of course, rickettsia. They bred fleas and lice by the millions, infected them, and developed dispersal systems like ceramic bombs designed to shatter on impact and release clouds of infected insects over Chinese cities. These were not theoretical exercises. These weapons were used, causing outbreaks of sickness that eliminated tens of thousands of civilians. They understood with absolute clarity the power of a pathogen like typhus to shatter a society from within. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union built vast and sophisticated biological weapons programs. While their primary focus was often on more contagious or lethal agents like smallpox and weaponized anthrax, the potential of rickettsial sicknesses was well documented. They were studied, cultivated, and stockpiled. And this points to the fundamental troubling duality of modern microbiology. The same knowledge and techniques used to create a vaccine are intimately related to the techniques used to increase a pathogen's virulence. The same laboratory equipment can be used to diagnose a sickness or to produce it in large quantities. Today, the grand state-sponsored programs of the Cold War are largely dismantled, but the knowledge remains. In an age of decentralized threats and non-state actors, the fear is that this knowledge could fall into the wrong hands. The spectre of typhus, therefore, has not been banished. It has simply transformed. It is no longer the inevitable camp follower of forces, the jail fever of crowded prisons, or even the forgotten epidemic of refugee encampments. It also exists as a dark potential, a blueprint for a weapon of mass disruption, resting quietly in scientific literature and security briefings. Our vigilance against it must therefore be multifaceted. It requires public health officials to remember the lessons of Naples. It requires doctors in emergency rooms to consider it in their diagnosis. It requires humanitarian aid workers to be prepared for it in zones of conflict and disaster. And it requires intelligence agencies to watch for the signs of its weaponization. The long bloody history of typhus is not truly finished. The pathogen that toppled empires and stopped forces has not been eradicated. It lingers, a persistent threat in the places we neglect, an ominous spectre in the realm of what is possible. The louse is patient, and its ancient companion, the rickettsia, is always waiting for another chance.